In many ways, I did receive some questions to consider, and I was jotting furiously additional because it was incredibly thought-provoking, everything there. So maybe as an initial question, and we'll start at the end over there and then work our way this way. You've seen this film before, but when you saw it again this time, what's something that stood out in your viewing of the film this time? So starting from there, coming this direction.
Well, first of all, I just like to thank, there are a number of folks here in the audience, John Paulson, who was producer and director, and also Barbara Balla, who helped produce the film and edit the film, did a wonderful job. And as you probably saw at the end, Leo Eaton actually passed on halfway through the production. So we made sure to recognize Leo's significant contributions. The memory of his energy, infectious desire to see the film actually produced really inspired us, I think, to continue and make that transition. So I just wanted to mention that briefly. For me, what I think is striking about the film is the number of different faith communities that were affected by various forms of persecution, challenged in vindicating their right to religious freedom. And that, of course, starts in the colonial period. And it reaches all the way up into the 20th century, and even still today. So the number of faith communities, the variations in the stories, and I would also say, I think one of the things that's striking about religious freedom is it's not, and this is brought out by a number of interviewees, it's not just a private right. It's not just something that you exercise in the safety of your own home. You see how religious freedom manifests itself in the context of schools and other voluntary associations that are so important to the United States, what it means to actually have a community in the United States. So I would say those are a couple of things that continue to just impress me as I watch the film. Hopefully with somewhat of a critical eye, having been involved in the making of it, but also grateful for all the contributions, including those who are here in the audience. Thanks.
Sure, I'll say two things. I think that's on. Is that on? Great. One, you can look at it as a negative, but I actually look at it as a positive. You can see all the different groups taking their lumps over time and getting mistreated over time. And that's, of course, terrible. I wish my country did a much better job than that. But on the plus side, I do think it does something to convey to religious people of all stripes that we actually all need to be in this together to fight for one another's religious liberty, right? The fact that almost every group has been on the receiving end of mistreatment related to religion and religious liberty is a bad thing, but it's also a good thing because it can help people understand why you need to stand with your brother and sister, even if you don't practice their faith. I'll say the second thing that really hit home, I haven't seen the film in a few months, but watching the Jewish section again and the reaction to Grant's order and the lynching, and just thinking, I know a lot of Jews who after October 7th, when they watched not just what happened in Israel on October 7th, but what happened in America after October 7th, feeling like yet again, this group of people feeling like, wait, I thought I was accepted here, and maybe I'm not again. And on our college campuses, in a lot of places in America, we've actually done a pretty rotten job since October 7th, 2023. That's a bad thing and a sad thing, but I think religious liberty law can actually help us do much better.
So, can you hear me? So I agree with this. Sort of layered over this experience of specific religious groups and their experiences of persecution is also this broader narrative of sort of the constriction and then the expansion of religious liberty. There are times in our history when it was harder, and then there were openings, and then it was hard again. And I think it's really just sort of moving into the present moment, and sort of ends on this note of increasing complexity in this country, like understanding that there are going to be moments of constriction, but then how do we learn from history to sort of like come out of that, to build the institutions that can be enduring and to bring us back to a place where we're realizing more robust conception of religious liberty.
This was my first time seeing the film, and it's a remarkable film. My congratulations to everyone who was involved in the making and shaping of the film. There's a lot to say about the U.S. part of it. In terms of my experience of having served as a U.S. ambassador, it is almost always minority religions that are the victims of religious discrimination and persecution across the globe in every country. And the fact that this film is focused around so many different faith groups of so many different sizes, seeing what the consequences are of persecution and discrimination, and the fact that they can be transcended and the nation transformed on religion, it's a vital lesson for the world. Because there are times when you're in the middle of fighting for your own rights in another country, or troubled as to how much you think, if you're in the majority religion, you can give to minority religions without jeopardy. To see how America, that is still, with all of our problems, and I'm sure we'll debate some of those, is regarded as the key model of what true robust religious freedom means. And with a great deal of respect and appreciation for that, the fact that it wasn't there from the beginning, that there was a journey to that, and we were able to transcend the limitations we had, is an important message to the world. And I hope this gets seen far beyond the United States.
Yeah, I mean, given the fact that, our country has the Declaration of Independence, we have the Bill of Rights clearly laying out religious liberty. I mean, why have we struggled so much as a country over the centuries? And I'll just open it to anyone who wants to answer. I mean, what are the factors that have caused that to be such a struggle when it's so clearly, seemingly laid out in the Bill of Rights?
I'm happy to go first. I'd say human nature, and it's protected in the Bill of Rights. Why? It's protected in the Bill of Rights precisely because we worry that the majority will run roughshod over the minority, right? The popular beliefs will run roughshod over the unpopular beliefs. And it had to be baked into the Constitution, I think, because the framers correctly judged that left unrestrained, the majority wouldn't always be so kind to the minority. And so that's something that, as Asma says, just like plays out generation after generation. But I really do think the arc is very much in a good direction. And I think what we've seen over the last 75, 80 years out of the Supreme Court has been mostly good and mostly building up strong protections in a way that I think make it easier and better and less surprising for us to be able to treat a different religious minority better or respect somebody who's got a less popular belief. So
it's an ideal, and it's one that we have to sort of think through sort of iterations and contestations and negotiation. And I think that's what the story is. It's just like that process of negotiation, and it's a process of making mistakes. And at the same time as we're negotiating, again, there's sort of the changing landscape of who's an American and what America is. And also just the legal conceptions, like what does religious liberty mean? Like how best to protect that, and how best to protect it for all Americans. So it's just it's an intellectual, it's an ethical, it's a moral and emotional negotiation, and I think that's what we see in the story.
Yeah, I would add that in the category of human nature is when one has power, one is tempted to use that power to try and take their views, including religious views, and to make it what the norm for everyone should be. And that was captured in the descriptions of a number of the early periods of America. America was founded by groups of people with diverse religious views. What they had in common was almost all came from having been persecuted somewhere. They saw what happened when you meld government coercive power with religion. And the fact that the two clauses are there, no establishment of religion and freedom of religion. You can't really have one without the other. That was the lesson that was brought to bear in this. And we've had our ups and downs, depending on where in the country we're talking about. It's been very different in New England in the early decades, even after the Constitution, of how the states handled this differently. And we still feel the pressures exist today, with some of the Christian nationalist groups that exist today who would like to see America restructured into a country in which the Christian Bible and the Christian beliefs have special protections and a special status in America. We're not done with all of these struggles in trying to get it right in this country and how to balance out freedom of religion without melding it with the coercive power of government to impose those ideas on anyone who doesn't believe them.
Say briefly, I mean, one of the interesting things about the history as I delved into it is that America also responds in interesting and different ways in wartime struggles, different conflicts. In fact, if you think about the Revolutionary War, that's the period of the Baptists are actually in some ways vindicating their rights to be a part of the U.S. experiment in religious liberty. But then we see in the Civil War the challenge that the Jews face. So you have, in fact, the pressures of war tugging in interesting and challenging ways with respect to religious freedom. And then we come up to World War II, and we see this turning on a dime that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Texas talks about. So war sometimes works in favor of religious liberty, but in some cases it works against it. And so that's one of the interesting aspects of this history that I didn't know a lot about when we first got into it, but I think to me was revealing and gets to the question you were asking.
Yeah, and I think even as we think of internally here in the U.S. versus when we've had experiences overseas and seeing religious liberty in other parts of the world, it's interesting. And I know for me, I was traveling in another part of the world once. I did an outward expression of a religious practice by praying for a meal, and a person near me came by and said, "Oh, you're religious." I said, "Yes, I'm Christian." They said, "Oh, we know you're a Christian. You're from America, but you're religious." And it was this moment where in my mind, I didn't kind of separate those two, but to have that kind of put in front of me. So even in the scene where President Obama was giving his inauguration, and he even listed in his categories of faith, and he said, "or those that are non-religious," and how that was part of it too, because one of the things that many people of faith would say as the society becomes increasingly secular, does religious liberty matter, and how so? And then how does that maybe more secularization, how will that play out even in the future when it comes to religious liberty?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly. I'm sure others will have good thoughts on this. I think Rick Garnett puts it well, Professor Rick Garnett of Notre Dame, that you can think of religious liberty even for a non-believer as sort of a public good. You know, that it actually is a little bit like clean air or roads. I'd go a step further and sort of echo Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, and that you can think of religious liberty in the context of the voluntary associations that make America such a rich, pluralistic, abundant society where lots of public goods that are helping your average person, whether that's a soup kitchen, or it's a school, or it's a hospital, or an orphanage, are ultimately run or managed or developed by religious institutions. So without those faith communities, you have a lot of public services, a lot of services for the average person that would either not be provided or which government would have to step in and provide, with all the attendant questions around either competence or what would happen to our liberties as a result.
I mean, I think what he's getting at is that when religion has a sort of smaller role in society, or there's sort of increasing secularism, it's not a given that people are going to understand what the value of religion or religious liberty is. And so we have to start justifying it in these other sort of pragmatic ways. Of course, that shouldn't take away from the fact that quite apart from the benefits, sort of societal benefits, that are in terms of the contributions of religious individuals and communities, that is still a right that should be protected. And I think that with the rise of secularism, that is something that needs to be advocated, has to be compelling. And I think a big part of that, earlier I referenced the sort of periods of constriction and expansion, and I think there's something inherent in the rise of secularism that says that this might be a period of such constriction, right? We have to begin to rethink or reformulate how we're going to be talking about religious liberty. And I think a huge part of that, and I think that we're seeing signs of that, is just new sort of coalitions that are being formed, unlikely, sort of strange bedfellows. Groups that aren't used to working together are finding ways to work together because of sort of a shared common denominator, which is the basic respect for religion and religious liberty, whatever religious particular faith might be protected by that.
I'm always an optimist, and I'll just say I actually have faith in the secularists. So I'm not willing to, I agree, as fewer people are religious, you need to do more to justify to people who don't practice religion why they ought to be kind to their neighbors who want to practice religion. But I actually have great faith that most decent people who are atheist and agnostic can still recognize that their neighbor ought to be allowed to be different from them, whether it's a different race, different religion, different whatever, and that just a matter of common decency is to leave room for your neighbor to live out his or her life in the way that is deeply important to them. And so I think it's completely possible for America to become less religious and stay deeply committed to religious liberty, but I do think it takes work. And I also think it should be clear, or it needs to be made clear, even to people who don't have a particular religious faith, that they really do benefit from religious liberty. They benefit from their neighbors being able to be here. Thomas talked about wars, right? One of the early American decisions was, we decided, even though we couldn't make the Quakers fight, that people who were willing to go to jail over their religious beliefs actually made for pretty good citizens, and actually we'd like to have them around, right? And who did the Quakers end up benefiting? Well, lots of people, but including the slaves, right? The Quakers ended up being around to lead the first abolition movements, right? So we're actually a better, richer society if we allow for a diversity of beliefs, including religious beliefs, and in many ways those religious beliefs can often benefit everybody.
I just add that if you believe in democracy and you believe in other fundamental human rights and you believe in the other rights protected in the Bill of Rights, they cannot exist without freedom of conscience. And if there's no freedom of conscience on a religious basis, there's no freedom of conscience in reality for anything, and all other rights are going to be jeopardized. So there's that impact as well that benefits everyone.
Just as you mentioned democracy, I mean, the interplay between religion and democracy is one that I think we see playing out because people will vote their conscience, and their conscience comes from their kind of religious background. And I was interested in the film to see that even interplay where the Supreme Court made the decision and then Congress with RFRA over kind of ruled it in that interplay and even that separation of powers. When you think of contemporary legal cases, and contemporary, let's say the last 10 or 20 years, that involve religious liberty, what are some of the most important, and what would you prognosticate in the next 5 or 10 years? What may be some of the things that start percolating when it comes to things that may go before Supreme Court or need to be adjudicated through Congress?
I'm happy to go first. I'm a big fan of what the Supreme Court has done on religious liberty in the last 15 or so years. I think the court has done a really good job, and actually a really good job across the political spectrum on the court. These are not usually just 5-4 decisions. They're very often 9-0 decisions where all of the justices can agree that we ought to protect religious liberty. Let me just give you 2 examples. Thomas was mentioning how war stresses the system. It does. Pandemics stress the system. COVID stressed the system. Big social changes stress the systems, right? So think about the movement we've had on same-sex marriage, which the Supreme Court recognized as a constitutional right about a decade ago. At the same time, the court recognized it, although it didn't decide it in the same case, but they started giving signals that even though the court's going to recognize a right of people of the same sex to get married, right, the government can't stop it, that it would still protect religious liberty. And since then, there have been several cases at the Supreme Court where the court has gone ahead and said, look, we were serious that we're protecting a constitutional right for 2 men or 2 women to get married, but we're also quite serious about protecting the right of people of different religious beliefs to not go along with that and not participate in it and not support it if they don't want. And so we had a case at the Supreme Court called Fulton, which was over Catholic charities in Philadelphia that wanted to keep participating in foster care, even though they wouldn't place children with either an unmarried opposite-sex couple, that got no attention, or a same-sex couple, that got all the attention. But the Supreme Court decided 9-0 that we can both have same-sex marriage and gay adoption and gay foster care, but we don't need to make the Catholic Church be part of it if the Catholic Church has an objection to it. So I actually think the court has been doing a lot with religion and religious liberty and doing a lot in the direction of saying we can disagree on big important things, but we can still find ways to live in peace. And I'm heartened that often, not always, but often those decisions have been 9-0 or 7-2. They haven't particularly been close. And I think it's good that the justices can reach agreement like that.
I think you do.
I could talk all day, but I just don't want to monopolize it.
All right, well, the question up here was, does someone want to add on the prognostication? And maybe I can withdraw that question if that would get us into waters that we just don't know where the future is holding. So let me pivot a little bit, because somewhere in the movie it did say that there is at times a kind of an underlying sentiment that politics is supposed to be secular. I think that was even the line they quoted here. But I think we're seeing even more and more that like politics and personal religious conviction, they are intertwined, but they also can get challenging and get murky. So what do we, when we talk about religious freedom, when it starts crossing into very public space of politics, politicians, how people vote, what are the kind of the challenges there that you can see, and how do we make sure like the majority doesn't then have tyrannize the minority? And is this where the Supreme Court or other places have to step in to make sure that we keep politics and religious freedom in check?
Well, I think you've posed a number of questions there. I'll just briefly point out what I thought was one of the more poignant moments in the film, which is when Professor and also former Judge Michael McConnell points to the Baptist example, and he says, if the Baptists had stayed out of politics, we wouldn't have had the First Amendment. And so I think that's an important cautionary note about the comment that you sometimes hear, which is, religion and politics have to be entirely separate. The reality is that people are going to be motivated in the public sphere in part by their religious convictions. And to the extent that that's done peaceably and people assemble peaceably and it's done respectfully, we should welcome those voices into the public square, and we should welcome them as part of the political process. So that, to me, was one of the more important points that was brought out in the movie.
I mean, I think I am going to hand it to Rabbi Saperstein to elaborate on this, but I think when he was kind of talking about Christian nationalism and his concerns about that, I mean, it's really kind of like creating a distinction between religion and conscience as a motivating factor in the way that we sort of help bring about an America that we think is the America that is good for humanity, right? So there's a very sort of like base sort of moral foundation, but I think the concerns sort of come into play when that conception is one in which we're trying to, in some concrete way, particularly through enactment of law and policies, trying to exclude other people. So in trying to carve out a space for ourselves, that's one thing, but it's an entirely different thing when that process of carving very intentionally tries to exclude others.
Maybe I'll just say one more thing as these gentlemen are thinking more significant thoughts than mine. One part that was left out of the movie that we considered putting in, and Barbara, I'm sure you'll remember, and John, part of as we think about politics and religion, one of I think the messages of the movie is that the question of religious freedom is really not a partisan one. It's really a constitutional one that's deeply embedded in the traditions and history of America. It really transcends at least politics in a democratic sense. It's reached that point of national consensus enshrined in not only the Constitution, the text of the federal Constitution, but also the state constitutions. And so that's, I think, one of the more important points of the movie. So just wanted to emphasize that.
It was until you get to the point Asma was just talking about, which is what happens when religious freedom claims intersect with civil rights protections that bring other people into the center of society with equal rights and opportunities. And how do you balance those out? Or, as we say, what constitutes a compelling interest? Sufficient enough to limit the application of another fundamental right, including religious freedom. We're going to disagree on some of that balance, but there are It's always true when you have two valid moral principles that are in tension with each other. If it's a helpful image, if those of you who don't have much of a background and came just out of interest in this, I often think of the wall that for me, it's a very helpful metaphor, but as being a one-way wall. That is, it really restricts government. All of the Bill of Rights are written in a way to restrict what government do, but it doesn't really restrict what religion can do. So religion has the same the same free speech rights as any non-religious entity or person does. Religion has the same freedom of the press rights. It has the same right to petition the government for redress of grievances. It has the same right to associate with like-minded people. You can't really have freedom of worship and religious life without the right of association here. So first, it means that human rights and religious freedom are integrated with each other, because if you don't have freedom of speech, you don't have freedom of the pulpit. If you don't have freedom of press, you can't print your religious texts and your holy scriptures. If you don't have the right to assembly, you can't get together for group worship here, and go down the list. So you need all of those rights in the First Amendment in order to have robust religious freedom. But those same rights allow religious groups to address government just like everyone else does. It shouldn't have a privilege base, and it shouldn't have a less of a role. But once you become government, then you are constrained by all of the limitations of the Establishment Clause here, whether you are a religious person or entity or not. And on that, there may be some. As a concept, I think we'd agree. As applied, I think you would find that there are differences amongst us.
Yeah, I also, forgive me, I should have completed the thought too on the part, Barbara, that we ended up omitting. The piece that we omitted, which I think is sort of in some ways an untold story in this, because this is really about America's story of religious liberty, was the part about following World War II. The UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights is promulgated and agreed to by almost all of the countries of the world, a very substantial majority of them. And what's interesting about that is that the free exercise clause and a lot of these basic freedoms in the Bill of Rights are pushed into the international sphere. And that's a story that's still playing out today, is to what extent are the ideals of the U.S. Constitution now embedded in an international understanding of human rights, and to what extent is religious freedom being vindicated in other countries as well.
But you need to see this movie to understand that. In other words, it was exactly the point where the Supreme Court of the United States, beginning in the 1940s, towards the end of that period of time, the Universal Declaration was being shaped through the robust expansion of both clauses that we saw through the period of the 1960s, when the ICCPR, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, that gave actual legal status to the ideas in the Universal Declaration here. So, what we did had enormous impact in the way that is shaped and became accepted as norms. Somewhat questioned today for cultural and political and intellectual reasons from the left and the right around the world. But nevertheless, these are the official norms. Article 18 and 19 and 20 in the ICCPR as it affects them. So we had an enormous impact on that. And of course, on a civil basis, the real test is nobody's rights as a citizen anywhere should ever depend upon their religious identity, their religious practices, their peaceful practices, or their religious beliefs, as I think the film caught in one of the excerpts there.
So we have time for a couple more questions, but one of the things that struck me in the film too is the dichotomy between belief and action. Like, you can believe whatever you want, but it's when it moves to action that it causes having at times challenges, or those are the moments. Is that an artificial dichotomy? And is that really how we live out in the world, and beliefs produce actions? I mean, it kind of is a little bit tighter than that, than how the film seemed to portray it, at least at one point.
Yeah, so I think it is I mean, it's a real distinction, right? What happens in your head is different from what you do out in the world in your life. But I do think that the name of the movie is free exercise. The clause of the First Amendment protects the free exercise of religion, and I think most of the time that means people should really be free to exercise their religion to live it out. The nice thing about living in a big country with lots of governments, with lots of different ways to get things done, is it's really awfully rare that the government really needs to force this one person or this one group to violate his or her religion. Really, most of the time in a diverse place, we really can find ways to work around different religious beliefs, and we should. And so that's been part of our law. In the modern era, the court has more and more protected religious exercise in practice, and I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good part of how diverse people can live together in peace.
I think you're right to point out this question between this sort of distinction between belief and action, and I think it's a little more complex than that, as you also rightly allude. I think one of the interesting questions is, and you see this obviously in the question of polygamy, in the Mormon episode, and then you contrast that with some of the questions related to, well, can a military person of a particular religious background have a beard of a particular length? Or that's an action of you're growing a beard. Or, of course, in the Smith case where someone is smoking peyote. But you can think of these as perhaps actions that are of more individual nature, that don't necessarily involve the externalities of a family or how we're defining some of those other questions that might involve the liberties of other people. So where we draw that line between a kind of individual liberty and perhaps where religious liberty affects the broader community, I think that's where the court has tried to draw lines, but it's a hard one. But again, I think just trying to say it's just belief and action is doesn't quite deal with these more recent questions of peyote use or beards in the military, or some of these other questions where there is clearly an action involved, and we've allowed that action. To Mark's point, free exercise, it's meant to provide you with liberty beyond just what's in your head or the worship that you might do in your own home or in your church. And that's also where this question of, well, where does religious liberty play when people are thinking about establishing a religious school and having the right to hire faculty members who might be of that religious background. So again, that's another question of, conduct, where we're trying to provide as much religious liberty as possible, and where potentially the infringement on other people's liberties is not as apparent, therefore we allow it.
All right, well, we are actually nearing the end of time, but I'm sitting here thinking that we just got to watch this as a group. We have people connected to the film and others that were part of it that are here on stage with us. But here in December, this film will be released on national platforms. People will be watching it in their living rooms. When they finish watching it, what would be the things that you would hope that they would then do from that moment when it comes to having seen this film, maybe in their home? What actions are we hoping that would produce going forward after they watch this film from whatever perspective?
Respect your neighbor even though your neighbor's different, right? Just honestly walk down the street and be like, oh, my neighbor, to me this is a quintessentially American experience, right? My neighbors are different colors and different religions and different everythings, right? And that's good. And so looking out your door, meeting people on the street saying, oh, they're different from me, and that's okay, right? That most of the time the right answer really is, my neighbor gets to live out his or her life in peace, and I don't need to find ways to interfere with that.
And I would just add to that, in addition to recognizing your neighbor as someone deserving of respect, having the capacity to enter into civil discourse with respect, and having this capacity to disagree peaceably, and to gather and have these conversations, in some cases that might be motivated by differences in religious belief, but still to be able to do that in a respectful way. So in some ways it's hopefully a call to action for respectful and peaceful civil discourse, and hopefully giving people the courage to have conversations and debates that are uncomfortable, but still after which they can be friends.
I mean, I think these points about respect and common decency and civil discourse are really important. But even more fundamental is just how this is sort of implicates their own interests, right? And I think we were getting at this earlier that a lot of this is really just sort of much beyond the question of religion to even affect the non-religious because it's a question of individual autonomy. And so everybody has a stake in it, like everybody has an interest in it. And I think that with that sort of basic understanding of just sort of like how it implicates you personally, if that could be a way to complicate, I would say beyond civil discourse, actually complicate your assumptions about what's happening in the space of religious liberty or the First Amendment more broadly, and to begin to question some of sort of our instinctual sort of reactions.
Said it beautifully.
They've said it beautifully. So, again, thank you all that are here. There is the opportunity for any of you who would like to do a tour. We have one of our tour guides who's going to tour our gallery, and we do have one right now that opened in September called the Megiddo Mosaic Foundations of Faith, and then another one called Sacred Words that they will be taking you on. But again, thank you all for coming this afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity, and really thank you for all of you that were involved in the film, because it does help us to have that kind of common decency as we realize we are different, but there's something that brings us all together around this concept of religious liberty. So again, thank you for all being here, and have a good afternoon.